The night it all began was not in some shadowy corner or behind a locked door, but in the middle of a brightly lit banquet hall. Music drifted through the chandeliers and laughter floated over the clinking of glasses. I had just stepped away from the table when I caught the sound of my husband's voice, softer than usual, almost conspiratorial. My eyes followed it instinctively and landed on him, leaning close to my oldest friend, her hand resting just a second too long on his arm. It wasn't a kiss, and maybe most women would have brushed it off, but the smile on her lips was not the smile of friendship. Something in me tightened. I stood frozen in that moment, knowing with absolute certainty that my life was about to divide into before and after. Before I continue, let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more true family stories. My name is Elena Brooks. I am 46 years old, and for most of my life, I believed I had built something solid, a home filled with warmth, a marriage steady enough to withstand the usual storms, and a daughter who was the heart of my days. Mark and I met in our 20s back when I was just beginning as a counselor, and he was climbing through the corporate ranks of regional sales. He was the ambitious one, the dreamer, who liked to talk about houses bigger than ours, vacations longer than we could afford. I was the steady one, grounded in schedules and small routines. Somewhere in the middle, we built what looked from the outside like a partnership that worked. Our families admired what we had. Walter, my father-in-law, liked to brag that Mark was the kind of man who could provide, and I took quiet pride in being the kind of woman who could keep a home running with grace. My parents had taught me that dignity wasn't loud, that love was measured in quiet evenings around the table, in the safety of knowing you could depend on one another. For years, that was how I lived, believing in the quiet kind of love, the dependable sort that doesn't make headlines, but survives. I thought Mark shared that same belief. Tessa had been part of my world long before Mark was. We had met in college, and though our paths drifted in and out over the years, she was always the one I called when I needed help planning a party, or when Lily needed advice about scholarships. She had a knack for charm, for making every room feel like her stage. I admired that, once mistaking her flair for generosity rather than performance. She had her own stories of complicated romances, but she often said she envied me for having something stable. I used to believe her. Life had its flaws, of course. Mark worked long hours, and there were times I felt more like a supporting character in his ambitions than an equal partner. He had a way of dismissing my concerns with a quick, "Don't make a big deal out of it," the kind of phrase that seems harmless, until it repeats often enough to carve away at your confidence. Still, I told myself it was normal, the cost of being married to someone with drive. I had learned to swallow small hurts the way some women swallow pills quickly with water, hoping they dissolve before they leave a mark. The night of that banquet, though, I felt something shift. It wasn't only the touch of Tessa's hand on Mark's arm, or the way he leaned toward her with that familiar glint of amusement in his eyes. It was the realization that the two people I had trusted most could exchange a look like that, a look meant to exclude me. It was not yet proof, not yet betrayal written in bold, but it was enough. Enough to plant a seed of unease, enough to tell me that the life I thought was steady had cracks I could no longer ignore. And as I stood there smiling tightly at guests who passed by, I knew this was just the beginning. The following week, I found myself replaying that night over and over, trying to convince myself I had misread it. Mark had a way of brushing things off so casually that doubt began to creep in. At breakfast on Sunday, he poured coffee into my mug as though nothing had happened. His hand brushed mine with practiced familiarity, his voice light when he asked about my plans for the day. I almost believed him. Almost. But behind my smile, I could still see Tessa's hand on his arm, the secret curve of her mouth when she looked at him. Small signs followed me like shadows. Mark's phone, which once lay openly on the counter, now spent more time in his pocket. He silenced notifications during dinner, claiming he was too tired for work messages. When I teased lightly, asking if his phone had become more important than me, he laughed it off and said I was being silly. The words were soft, but they carried the same weight as that night in the banquet hall. Each dismissal carved a little deeper into the place where trust used to live. I tried to distract myself with ordinary routines. At school, I focused on the students, their essays, their worries about college applications. In the evenings, I listened to Lily's stories about her classmates, and folded laundry while Mark scrolled on his phone with his back half turned. On the surface, nothing had changed, but the air between us felt thinner, stretched like fabric worn too many times. When his phone lit up across the room, my eyes went to it before I could stop myself. I hated that instinct, but it came anyway, sharp and involuntary. Tessa was still present in my life, which made everything harder. She called about a fundraiser she wanted me to attend, her voice as cheerful as always. When I hesitated, she pressed, insisting it would be good for me to get out of the house. I agreed because refusing would have raised questions, and part of me still hoped I was wrong. That night, I stood beside her at a table covered in raffle tickets and glass bowls of punch, listening to her laugh too brightly at a joke I hadn't heard. Across the room, Mark was greeting donors, his hand lingering at her waist as he passed. My stomach turned, but I said nothing. At home, I began to notice his late nights increasing. Meetings, he claimed, or last-minute client dinners. When he returned, the smell of cologne clung to him like an afterthought, not the one he usually wore. Once, as I gathered laundry, I found a faint smear of foundation on his shirt collar. He explained it away with a quick laugh. Someone at the office must have hugged him too closely. I nodded, but my chest burned. The excuses were piling higher than the laundry basket in my arms. One evening, after Mark left for another dinner meeting, our neighbor Carol stopped me outside. She had known me for years, the kind of neighbor who noticed details and carried quiet wisdom. She tilted her head gently and asked if everything was all right. When I assured her it was, she gave me a look that said she wasn't convinced. She didn't press further, only touched my arm softly and told me to take care of myself. The kindness in her tone nearly broke me. It reminded me that I was not imagining the changes, even if no one dared speak them aloud. Lily, busy with her own teenage world, noticed less, but not nothing. One night, she asked why Dad always seemed to have work dinners lately. I smoothed her hair back and told her adults sometimes had busy seasons. She accepted my answer, but looked at me longer than usual, her eyes searching mine as though she knew there was more. I kissed her forehead and changed the subject, determined to protect her from the undercurrent. I was only beginning to face myself. The following weekend, Tessa came by with a bottle of wine, saying she wanted to catch up. We sat at the kitchen table, and she spoke of her latest projects, her voice bright, her laughter effortless. But her eyes flickered around the house as though cataloging the details of my life. I watched her lips as she sipped, remembering the way those same lips had curved toward my husband at the banquet. Every laugh felt rehearsed, every story carefully placed. When she asked casually where Mark was, I said he was running errands. The truth was, he had left that morning, saying he had to stop by the office. My silence was deliberate. I wanted to hear her reaction. She only smiled, poured herself another glass, and changed the subject. Later that night, when Mark returned, he carried shopping bags with a few groceries, as though to prove his story true. But the receipt in the bag showed a purchase at a store across town, nowhere near his office. He placed the items on the counter and kissed my cheek, his eyes steady, almost daring me to ask. I didn't. Instead, I stored the receipt in the drawer, where I kept small, but telling fragments of truth. The cracks in our marriage were no longer invisible. They showed in the way he avoided my eyes, in the silence that stretched between us, when once we had shared easy conversation. They showed in Tessa's sudden interest in being part of our lives again, her phone calls too frequent, her visits too convenient. My doubts were no longer whispers. They were steady voices filling the quiet spaces of the house. I still hadn't confronted either of them. Some part of me clung to the fragile hope that I was wrong, that these were coincidences strung together by fear. But hope was thinning, and instinct told me the truth. The life I thought I knew was changing piece by piece, while I stood still watching it unravel. And deep inside, I knew it was only a matter of time before one of them made a mistake I could no longer ignore. I began to live in a strange, in-between place, half in the life we had built, and half in the one I suspected was unraveling. Mark's patterns became harder to ignore, even as I tried to bury myself in daily routines. He lingered over his phone with the screen angled away from me, or slipped into the other room when calls came in. When I asked simple questions, his tone carried an edge, as though I were interrupting something far more important than our conversation. Nights grew longer in their silence. He would return late, claiming another client dinner, and collapse into bed without looking at me. I lay awake beside him, staring at the faint outline of his face in the dark, trying to understand when he had become a stranger. I longed for the man who once brought me flowers from the grocery store just because he saw they were on sale and thought of me. That man seemed buried beneath layers of distance and carefully chosen words. I carried my doubts quietly, careful not to let them spill onto Lily. She was busy with senior year, her life filled with rehearsals, study groups, and dreams of college. One evening, she sat across from me at the kitchen table asking if her father would be at her upcoming recital. I assured her he would, though I wasn't certain, and her hopeful smile was enough to make my chest ache. She deserved stability, not the uncertainty that now consumed me. Even simple errands revealed truths I didn't want to face. At the grocery store, I noticed an unfamiliar brand of wine tucked into the cart, something sweeter than I ever drank. When I asked about it, Mark shrugged, saying a colleague had recommended it. Later that night, the bottle was gone before I had even opened it. I never saw him drink it at home, and I wondered where it had gone. Tessa's presence became more suffocating. She called at odd hours with reasons that felt flimsy advice on a menu, a quick question about a school fundraiser, a laugh about some memory from years ago. Her voice lingered too long, too cheerful, too insistent. Each time I hung up, the weight in my stomach grew heavier. I wanted to confront her, but fear held me back. Fear of what she might confirm with a single word or careless smile. There were moments when the weight of it all became too much, and I retreated into small corners of solace. I sat with Carol one afternoon on her porch while Lily was at practice. She handed me a glass of iced tea and asked nothing at all. Just listened as I stumbled through half-truths about stress at work and sleepless nights. She nodded with the patience of someone who had lived long enough to know what silence often concealed. Her quiet understanding gave me strength, though I still couldn't bring myself to speak the full truth aloud. At home, I moved through rooms filled with echoes. The couch where Mark and I once sat close now seemed divided by an invisible wall. Meals at the dining table felt like performances, his fork scraping against the plate in rhythm with my forced questions. Even Lily noticed her eyes shifting between us as though she were reading lines from a play with no ending. One Saturday morning, Mark left early saying he had to meet a client before lunch. Hours later, I found his briefcase still by the door. My hands hovered over it, trembling as I resisted the urge to look inside. I told myself I wasn't that kind of woman, that I wouldn't snoop or invade his privacy. Instead, I sat in the quiet house, my eyes locked on the briefcase, like it might open on its own and reveal everything. The loneliness that followed me each day became its own kind of betrayal. It wasn't just the suspicion of infidelity. It was the absence, the way he no longer reached for my hand, the way laughter had vanished from our home. Each small omission was like a pinprick, not enough to destroy me at once, but relentless in its accumulation. I folded towels with hands that shook, stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror until my own face felt unfamiliar, and wondered how much longer I could carry the silence without breaking. The recital finally came, and as Lily stood on stage, her eyes scanned the audience for her father. His chair beside me remained empty. I clapped louder to fill the space, smiling for her sake, but inside I was hollow. When she leaned against me afterward, asking if he had been stuck at work, I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. Her disappointment was quiet but sharp, and I could feel it settle between us like a shadow. That night, after Lily went to bed, I sat alone in the kitchen with the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. The clock ticked past midnight before Mark returned his tie loose, his smile faintly apologetic. He kissed the top of my head, murmured something about deadlines, and went straight to bed. I stayed seated at the table, staring at the spot where his briefcase still rested by the door. I knew then that my silence could not last forever. The weight of what I carried was pulling me under, and soon I would have no choice but to face the truth head on. And when that moment came, I would be ready. The night of Lily's recital stayed with me like a splinter I couldn't remove. I had sat there alone, clapping too loudly to fill the silence of his absence, and afterward I held my daughter as she tried not to show her disappointment. That moment cracked something open inside me. It wasn't only the missed recital, though, that hurt more than anything. It was the realization that the man I had built my life beside could choose someone else's company, someone else's attention over his own family. For days, I moved through the house as though testing each step of a fragile floor. I noticed details I had once ignored, a faint trace of perfume that wasn't mine, clinging to his jacket, the way he tilted his phone slightly when messages appeared, the cautious smile that flashed across his face when he thought no one was watching. Each sign gathered in me like storm clouds, until even the smallest silence felt heavy with meaning. I didn't confide in anyone at first. I went about my work guiding students through essays and college forms, smiling at their parents during meetings, but my heart carried a private ache. Carol asked once more if everything was all right, her sharp eyes lingering on me longer than usual. I told her I was simply tired from school. She nodded gently, but her silence said she knew better. One evening, as I folded laundry, my phone buzzed with a message from Tessa. She wanted to meet for coffee the next day, just the two of us. I stared at the screen, wondering if she was reaching out from friendship or guilt. My fingers hovered before I finally replied, yes. If there was a truth to uncover, perhaps she would reveal it herself. We met at a cafe downtown, the kind with tall windows and soft music that masked conversations. Tessa arrived in a bright scarf, smiling as though nothing in the world weighed on her. She spoke of parties she was planning and the clients she was juggling. I nodded, stirring my coffee, waiting for her to mention Mark. She never did. But when her phone buzzed on the table, she turned it face down in a way that tightened my stomach. The same gesture Mark had been using at home. That night back at the house, I watched Mark move through our rooms with practiced ease. He spoke of a potential promotion of travel that might come with it, and though the words were confident, his eyes didn't quite meet mine. I listened quietly, then excused myself, retreating to the bedroom where I sat in the dark with only the glow of the hallway slipping through the door. My chest ached with the weight of unspoken truth. The following weekend, I found the confirmation I hadn't even meant to look for. Mark had left his blazer draped over the back of a chair, and as I gathered it with the rest of the laundry, something slipped from the pocket. A receipt from a restaurant across town, 2 entrees, a bottle of wine. The date and time lined up with a night he had claimed to be in meetings. My hands trembled as I held the paper, my breath catching in my throat. There was no denying it anymore. I placed the receipt back where I found it, not because I wanted to protect him, but because I wanted him to believe his secret was still safe. That night when he came home, I greeted him as usual, kissed his cheek, and asked if he was hungry. He smiled, relieved perhaps by my calmness, and sat down to eat. Inside me, though, something had shifted. I wasn't just hurt anymore. I was awake. The days that followed were filled with a new kind of silence. It wasn't the silence of doubt or fear, but of planning. I carried myself as though nothing had changed, but each word he spoke, each move he made, I observed carefully. His lies no longer confused me. They were notes in a song I had begun to understand. Lily noticed my quietness one evening as she worked on an essay at the kitchen table. She looked up and asked if I was feeling all right. I brushed her hair back and assured her I was fine, though my heart broke at the thought of what she might one day learn. I wanted to shield her at least until I knew how to move forward. One late night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Mark's breathing steady beside me, I realized I could no longer deny the truth. The man I loved was betraying me with the woman I had once called a friend. My silence had protected them, but it had nearly destroyed me. That would end now. I turned toward him in the dim light, his face slack with sleep, and I felt no urge to wake him or demand answers. The time for pleading or confrontation had passed. What lay ahead would not be loud or reckless. It would be deliberate, and for the first time in weeks, I closed my eyes with clarity instead of confusion. I didn't yet know exactly how I would act, but I knew this: I would no longer ignore the truth. Whatever came next, it would begin with me. Once I accepted the truth of Mark's betrayal, something inside me shifted. The grief and confusion that had consumed me gave way to a steadier resolve. I no longer wasted energy trying to deny what was happening. Instead, I turned that energy inward into quiet planning. The realization brought me an odd kind of calm. I didn't need a screaming match or some dramatic confrontation. What I needed was preparation. I began with the simplest things, the details Mark had overlooked in his arrogance. For years, most of our accounts had been in my name. The utilities, the streaming services, even the mortgage were handled through my income. He had enjoyed the image of being the provider, but the truth was more complicated. I logged into the accounts one by one, changing passwords, updating security, ensuring that he could not lock me out of what I had paid for. It felt like gathering small pieces of armor, each one protecting me from what might come. The second step was quieter still. I reached out to James Fulton, a lawyer recommended by a colleague. We met in a modest office lined with law books, the kind of space that smelled faintly of paper and coffee. He listened as I laid out the situation, his pen moving steadily across a yellow pad. When I finished, he leaned back, studying me with eyes that had clearly seen women in my position before. He didn't offer false comfort. Instead, he spoke in calm, precise terms about options, property lines, and timing. His clarity was a gift. It gave me structure where before I had only had pain. I didn't tell Lily about these steps. To her, I remained the steady mother she had always known, helping her with applications and talking about her future. She had enough to carry without the weight of her father's choices. When she asked why I was spending more evenings in the study, I told her it was paperwork from school. She accepted the answer, though I caught her watching me sometimes with quiet concern. At home, I moved with deliberate patience. Mark seemed relieved by my silence, mistaking it for forgiveness. He grew bolder in his carelessness. Phone calls answered in hushed tones, sudden errands that took him across town, the lingering scent of cologne that was not the one I had given him. I let him believe I hadn't noticed. That was the gift of my quiet. He underestimated me, and that gave me room to prepare. Tessa continued her visits, though less often. When she did appear, her laughter filled the kitchen in a way that once would have comforted me. Now it only reminded me of everything she was taking. I offered her tea, listened to her stories, and smiled at the appropriate moments, all the while studying her movements. The way her eyes drifted toward the door when she thought I wasn't watching. The way her phone vibrated against the table and she silenced it without explanation. Each detail settled into me like a puzzle piece confirming what I already knew. I kept my evidence simple and careful. The receipt from the restaurant, the sudden, unexplained expenses on our joint card, the calls that appeared at strange hours. I didn't need a mountain of proof, just enough to make denial impossible when the time came. Late at night, while Mark slept, I filed each piece into a folder tucked away in my desk. It wasn't revenge yet. It was simply protection. Walter called one Sunday afternoon to check in. He had always been proud of Mark, his only son, but there was an edge to his voice when he asked how we were doing. I chose my words carefully, speaking of Lily's achievements and the busy season at school. I didn't mention Mark's late nights or my quiet meetings with the lawyer. Walter sighed at the end of the call, telling me I had always been the steady one. I thanked him, though the words landed heavier than he intended. There were moments when my strength wavered. I would lie awake and think about the years I had given, the countless small sacrifices that had built the life we shared. My heart ached with memories of the man he had once been, or perhaps the man I thought he was. But each time the grief threatened to overwhelm me, I returned to the same truth: I had not failed. He had. And I would not let his choices destroy what I still had: my dignity, my daughter, my future. Even small gestures became part of my preparation. I began setting aside money in a separate account, funds from my counseling work that Mark never paid much attention to. I went through closets, noting which items were mine, which belonged to Lily, which would remain in the house when the time came. These tasks were mundane, almost domestic, but to me they were steps of quiet resistance. Each drawer organized, each document filed, was a declaration that I was no longer helpless. The turning point came one evening when Mark breezed into the kitchen with flowers in his hand. He set them on the counter, grinning like a man who had nothing to hide. "For you," he said, kissing my cheek. I smiled, thanked him, and placed the flowers in a vase. But as I arranged them, I felt no warmth. I knew exactly what he was doing, covering tracks, soothing guilt with gestures that cost him nothing. The sight of the blooms no longer softened me. They hardened me. They reminded me that he still believed I was blind. That night, when the house was quiet, I stood in the doorway of our bedroom and watched him sleep. His face was peaceful, his breathing steady, as though the world had given him no reason to worry. And perhaps it hadn't. Not yet. But I had. I had reasons enough to carry me through what came next. I didn't need to shout or accuse or plead. My strength would come in silence, in the careful steps that built toward a moment he could not escape. And as I closed the door softly behind me, I felt the first stirrings of something fierce, something steady. It was not anger. It was resolve. The time for doubt had passed. What lay ahead would not be easy, but I no longer feared it. My quiet steps had begun, and soon he would learn what it meant to underestimate me. The day of the gala arrived, one of those polished evenings Mark always looked forward to. It was hosted downtown, filled with clients, donors, and colleagues, the kind of crowd where appearances mattered most. I knew Tessa would be there. In fact, I counted on it. For weeks, I had carried evidence, quietly gathering the fragments of truth he thought I would never find. That night, I dressed with care, slipping into a gown that had been waiting in my closet for an occasion like this. It wasn't for him. It was for me, for the steadiness I needed to hold my head high. When we arrived, Mark was already in his element. His hand pressed lightly against my back as he greeted people, his smile wide and easy. He looked every bit the devoted husband, the respected professional. I watched him perform, introducing me as though nothing in our marriage had frayed, and I almost admired the ease of his deception. But then I caught sight of Tessa across the room, her eyes locking on his before shifting toward me. For a brief second, her expression faltered. She quickly smoothed it over with a laugh, but I had seen enough. The dinner began with speeches and applause, but my attention never left the two of them. Between courses, I excused myself, moving quietly toward the coat room where I had left my bag. Inside it, tucked between folded fabric, was the folder I had prepared. Copies of receipts, phone records, photographs, and a simple summary James had helped me craft. I slid it under my arm and returned to the table. My heartbeat steady, not racing. This wasn't a moment of impulse. It was the moment I had built toward. The room buzzed with conversation as dessert was served. Mark leaned toward Tessa, his voice lowered just enough for me to notice, not enough for others to hear. I rose from my chair, slowly smoothing the front of my gown, and tapped a glass with the edge of my spoon. The sound carried across the room, pulling eyes toward me. I smiled politely, thanking everyone for being there, then turned my gaze to my husband. "Since we're celebrating achievements tonight," I said evenly, "I thought it only right to share one of my own. I've spent the past few months documenting just how far my husband's dedication extends, not only to his work, but to my closest friend as well." A silence fell so complete that even the music seemed to dim. I laid the folder on the table in front of him, opening it for others to see. Receipts fanned out across the linen messages captured in print, each page a mirror of the life he had tried to hide. Mark's face drained of color. He reached for the papers, fumbling to gather them, but the damage was already done. Eyes that had once looked at him with admiration now turned with suspicion. Whispers spread from table to table like wildfire. Tessa stood frozen, her hand pressed against the stem of her glass, her mouth parted, but no words emerging. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Every detail spoke for itself. I thanked the room again for their attention, lifted my napkin from the table, and placed it neatly beside my plate. Then I walked out, my heels clicking softly against the polished floor. Behind me, chairs scraped and murmurs grew louder. I didn't turn back. In the car, the silence was heavy, but it wasn't mine to break. Mark finally slid in beside me, his hands shaking as he tried to start the engine. "You've humiliated me," he muttered, his jaw tight. I turned my head slowly, meeting his eyes with calm steadiness. "No, Mark, you humiliated yourself. I just refuse to cover it for you anymore." The words landed harder than any shout could have. He gripped the wheel, but he had no answer. At home, he paced the living room, his voice rising in desperate tones. He tried anger first, then apology, then silence, as though one of them might undo what had been laid bare. I listened to none of it. Instead, I gathered Lily's recital program from the counter, tucked it gently into my bag, and headed upstairs. That simple slip of paper reminded me of what truly mattered, the daughter who still needed me, the future I was determined to protect. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in weeks. Downstairs, I heard him moving about, opening and closing drawers, as though searching for a way back to the life he had lost. But the truth had been exposed, and there was no undoing it. The silence between us had changed. It no longer carried doubt. It carried certainty. By morning, I knew the storm had only just begun. What happened at the gala was only the first fracture. Soon, the consequences would spread further into his work, his family, and the very foundation of the image he had built. And I would be ready to watch it unfold. The fallout from the gala came quickly. By Monday morning, Mark's office was buzzing with the story, and whispers reached the partners before he had even stepped into the building. A client withdrew from a deal citing concerns about integrity, and within a week, the company asked him to take an indefinite leave. He tried to spin it as voluntary, but the truth was plain: his image had cracked, and those who once relied on him were now keeping their distance. At home, the tension thickened. He alternated between pleading and raging, moving through the rooms like a man trapped in a cage. He asked me to tell people it had been a misunderstanding, that I had overreacted. When I refused, his frustration boiled over. "You're ruining my life," he spat one evening, his voice echoing in the quiet kitchen. I didn't raise my voice. I simply told him the truth. "You ruined it yourself. I just stopped hiding it for you." The words left him trembling with anger, but I no longer feared his outbursts. Tessa fared no better. Her name, once associated with elegant fundraisers and polished charm, became tangled with whispers of betrayal. Invitations slowed, clients canceled contracts, and friends she had counted on began to keep their distance. I saw her once in town, standing outside a cafe with her phone pressed tightly to her ear. Her face was pale, her usual brightness dulled. She noticed me across the street, but instead of waving, she turned away. Even from a distance, I could see shame weighing on her shoulders. Walter called me after the news reached him. His voice was heavy, more disappointed than angry. He said he had warned Mark for years about his arrogance, about leaning on others instead of standing on his own. "You deserved better," he said quietly. For the first time since this began, I allowed myself a deep breath of relief. Walter wasn't blind to his son's failings anymore. His support was a steady anchor I hadn't realized I needed. Lily asked questions too, ones I couldn't avoid. She had seen the tension hurt enough to piece together fragments. I sat her down in the living room, the same space where family birthdays had once been celebrated, and I told her as much truth as she could handle. I didn't speak of details, only that her father had broken trust, and that I was choosing not to live in dishonesty. Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded slowly, her hand slipping into mine. "I'm proud of you, Mom," she whispered. That single sentence carried me through the hardest nights. Mark tried to rally. He posted online about resilience, about starting fresh, even about forgiveness. But the comments told another story. People remembered the gala, remembered the whispers of an affair, remembered the receipts. He couldn't bury it. When he realized charm no longer worked, he tried threats, muttering about finances and custody. But James had already guided me through the paperwork. My accounts were secure, my evidence airtight, and Lily's voice strong enough to matter. He was left swinging at shadows, powerless against the quiet strength I had built. Neighbors noticed too. Carol stopped by with a casserole one evening, her eyes full of concern. She didn't ask for details. She didn't need them. She simply told me she admired how I had handled myself. Her kindness reminded me that dignity doesn't always come from grand gestures. Sometimes it comes from steady composure in the face of betrayal. As the weeks passed, the walls around Mark closed in. Without his job, without his reputation, he became a man adrift. The friends who once laughed at his jokes didn't return calls. The colleagues who had admired him avoided his name. Even Tessa, once his confidant, had vanished into silence, her own world crumbling too quickly for her to save his. He was left pacing in a house that no longer felt like his own, surrounded by reminders of what he had lost. I moved quietly, steadily toward the future I had chosen. Papers were filed, accounts divided, and plans for Lily's next chapter took shape. Each step felt lighter, as though a weight was finally lifting from my shoulders. I didn't celebrate his downfall. I didn't need to. Watching him stumble beneath the weight of his own choices was enough. One evening, I found him sitting alone in the living room, staring at the blank television screen. He didn't look at me when he spoke. "I never thought you'd actually leave me," he said, his voice small, almost childlike. I stood in the doorway, my hand resting on the frame. "You never thought I'd see you clearly," I answered. His shoulders sagged, and in that moment, I knew the man who had once believed himself untouchable had finally understood. The justice wasn't in his collapse alone, but in the dignity I had reclaimed. I was no longer bound by silence, no longer shrinking in the shadow of betrayal. I had chosen truth, and it had set me free. Yet as I turned away that night, I knew there was still one step left. The final piece of closure hadn't yet come, and when it did, it would be mine to carry with grace. When the papers were finalized, I expected to feel a rush of triumph, but what came instead was stillness. The house was quieter without Mark's footsteps, and for the first time in years, the silence felt peaceful instead of heavy. Lily and I filled that space with our own rhythm, late-night tea in the kitchen, music humming softly, while she studied small conversations that reminded me how much strength can be found in ordinary moments. Mark moved out within weeks of the gala fallout, and though his presence lingered in the shape of the rooms, his absence brought clarity. His career never recovered the same shine, and the whispers about him and Tessa never truly faded. She slipped further into the margins, as well her name no longer spoken with admiration, but with a mix of pity and distance. I didn't chase either of them down for more answers. Their downfall unfolded on its own, without my hand needing to guide it further. Walter stayed in touch, his calls gentler now, stripped of the prideful certainty he once had about his son. He often asked about Lily, reminding me that she had always been his favorite part of our family story. I found comfort in those conversations, not because they erased what had happened, but because they acknowledged it without excuses. There was dignity in that honesty, even if it came late. With time, I began to rebuild life in a way that belonged only to me. I repainted the living room, chose softer colors, and moved the furniture into arrangements that suited the quieter evenings Lily and I shared. Carol stopped by often, bringing homemade bread, or simply sitting with me on the porch. Her steady presence was a reminder that not all relationships are fragile. Some endure because they are built on genuine care, not performance. The greatest change, though, was inside myself. I no longer walked carefully around the cracks in my life, pretending they weren't there. I had faced betrayal not by choice, but by necessity, and I had chosen dignity over despair. That decision gave me something Mark and Tessa never expected: freedom. They were left bound to their own choices, tangled in the webs they spun, while I stepped out into the light of my own making. I often thought back to the moment at Lily's recital, sitting in the empty seat beside me. That was the night I realized how much I had already lost, but also the night I began to see what I still had. My daughter's steady hand in mine, my own strength waiting quietly to be claimed, and a future that no longer depended on someone else's promises. The lesson I carried with me was simple, though not easy. When someone shows you disregard, when they treat your trust as disposable, the greatest act of justice is not revenge. It is refusing to let their choices define your worth. Dignity restored itself in me piece by piece. Not because Mark apologized, and not because Tessa disappeared, but because I stopped shrinking to fit the lies they built. Now when I walk through my home, I hear laughter again. Not the polished, performative kind that once filled crowded rooms, but the genuine sound of Lily telling me about her day, or the quiet hum of my own thoughts at peace. That is what justice feels like. Not loud, not cruel, but steady and true. Before we close, I'd love to know, has there ever been a moment in your life when silence gave you strength? Share your story in the comments, and if you'd like to hear more true family stories, you'll always find them here.